Well, thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to be part of this global conversation that we're having around cities. So I'm here today because I'm concerned, but I'm optimistic. I'm concerned because urbanization is happening, and it's happening really rapidly. I'm optimistic because I think we can do something about it. But it's going to take our ability to transcend the indicators, the indices, the ideas, the research that we've done, and actually translate that into action. That's what's going to be absolutely critical for us to do. I think we can do it, but as I said, we have to change the way we go to market when it comes to dealing with urban problems. We have to change our business model, and change isn't easy. And in order to do it, we need information. Now, in the time that I give you this talk, 2,000 people will move into a city. People are moving into cities at the rate of one person every 2 seconds. It's 2 people every 1 second, actually. That's how we got to 2,000. So the question is what are we going to do to ensure that this urbanization is sustainable? During my 20s, when I had time and a little bit of money, I'd get my backpack and I'd go travel somewhere. And the thing I love most about traveling is the people that you meet. So the people that you meet are the most important thing. You talk to them about their dreams, their aspirations, you learn about similarities, you find out about differences. And when we think about urbanization and organizing for urbanization, we really need to think about people. It's really about people. Kampala, Uganda is one place where I spend a lot of my time, in a slum called Namawango Zone B, in the middle of the city. It was made up of refugees from a war in the north, and when I first arrived, what I was really affected by was seeing how poor the living conditions were. Lack of access to education, sanitation, clean water. But as I spent more time there, what I really became impressed by is the ingenuity of the people, how they were able to solve problems and take control of things to improve their lives. So the women's organization who began selling crafts to fund their children's education. Really important stuff. So when we're thinking about organizing our cities, we need to think about how can we organize our cities to really help people unlock their potential. Freetown, Sierra Leone is another place where I spend a lot of my time. And while I was walking around the east end of the city one time, I had a conversation I think is really important for us also to remember. So I was speaking to a vendor by the side of the street because I really had nothing else to do, and we were having a conversation. When did you move to the city? What's your life like here? Well, it turns out he'd moved to the city from a rural area, and he'd been there for a few years, and we were talking about how hard life was in the city, how difficult it was. And I asked him, why did you move here? What brought you here? Do you regret it? And he said, no. And I said, why? And he reached into his shirt, and he pulled out a picture of his children. He said, I'm doing it for my kids. So when we're thinking about how to organize for urbanization, we really need to put that at the center of it. How do we organize cities so they can fulfill people's human aspirations for a better life? It's something that we all want across all the 60 countries I've been in. That's one common thread. We basically all want the same thing. If cities are going to recognize their potential, we have to understand how to better accommodate the rapid growth that's happening. So this slide was supposed to be 1985, the number of cities, big cities in the world. You fast forward to 2025, if you can see the graphics, there's a lot of big dots and the map has changed drastically. China will add in the next 20 years more people to its cities than the United States has population. India will add more people to its cities than Spain's population. This is going to result in big issues unless we change our business model. How are we going to provide services to these people? How are we going to allow them to recognize their ambitions, their hopes, their dreams? And the entities that typically have to provide this are governments. So my big question is, if we're going to organize for urbanization to proactively respond to the big challenges that we're going to face, how do we need to change their business model? How do we change the way that we respond to urban challenges, provide services, lay the groundwork for cities to be successful? The challenges are immense. We cannot wait. 30, 40, 50% growth. These are the numbers we're looking at a lot of cities, especially in the developing world. And our current way of addressing the issues does not allow us to solve these in the way that they need to be solved. So what are we going to do about it? We have to think about what a city is. I think that's absolutely critical. The dictionary defines a city as a large settlement of people. Walking around New York City, I think we can all agree that that's an inadequate definition. When we're thinking about producing outcomes in cities, what we need to think about is the types of assets that we have within a city. What can we leverage? Who are the stakeholder groups? And how can we get them on the same page? using outcomes, focused on outcomes, to produce real results and do so quickly. As I said, we cannot wait here. This is something that must be done. 4 numbers are on the board. People here live in New York City, so I'll tell you what these numbers are. $70 billion, that's the operating budget for New York City. 102, the number of organizations and mayoral bodies that run the city. 250,000, that's the number of employees. And 8.2 million, that's us. We're the New Yorkers. So the question is, how do we align all of these different groups in pursuit of the common objective, which is a more sustainable city, a city that produces better outcomes for people? And I think this frame can allow us to think about how we might tie these threads together. Funding. We spent $70 billion. Ideally, we'd want to allocate that $70 billion to the place where it would generate the highest environmental, social, or economic returns. Right now, we're running blind. We don't know how we allocate money creates what impacts. So we need to figure that out. And even more so, we need to manage for specific outcomes. If we're spending money, we need to understand the results that we're creating. And we need to transmit those results, those objectives, those goals, to the people that take care of the process, the 102 organizations that run New York City. And we need to figure out how they can serve citizens better, strategically based upon information, in terms of how we should be running our city. Then after we've got the processes in place, we need to get the people, the teachers, the sanitation workers, the police officers. How do we get them to realize that vision, to push it forward? Then we have our citizens. How can the 8.2 million New Yorkers be an agent for change as well? How can we work with the government to help them make these changes that are not very typical for government to do, working across silos, setting goals and really executing on them? How can we do that? How can we play a role? It's going to be about change. And I think the change is going to have to do with the way that we use information. In the last year, we've created more information than the rest of human history combined. And the amount of information produced is going to continue to increase exponentially. How are we going to use this information to improve the accountability and transparency of how our governments operate and what we know about how our governments operate? We can collect information now from systems within a city, from data that people provide. How are we going to use that to impact substantive change and produce outcomes for people? That's what's at stake here, and that's what we need to organize around. Now, I work for a technology company, but I'm not a technological determinist. Technology can pull information together. It can help us understand what's happening and where in different organizations in different parts of our city. But it's the accountability that it generates that's absolutely critical. It's the transparency. So how can the information that we collect transform the human interactions that produce outcomes in New York cities and cities around the world? I think we can do that by focusing on 3 areas. And I think these areas are really going to determine whether cities succeed or fail going forward. So number 1, how can we manage better? When we talk about change in a city, a lot of the things that comes up is politics or the way we used to do business. For me, those excuses don't cut it. The fact is we have a massive problem, and the way that we're going to get out of this challenge associated with urbanization is through better management. It's through a better approach. So New York City spends $26 billion a year on programs related to children. So that's the education system, social services, juvenile justice. At the same time, we only have a high school graduation rate of 65%. And while that's the highest it's been historically, I really think we can do better. So what if we put together a system that said, with this $26 billion, if we want to produce an outcome, which is increasing high school graduation rates, how should we be allocating our money across the various city agencies that are working towards that objective? Should we be investing more in early childhood education? Should we be hiring more teachers? Should we be sending our social workers on more frequent visits for students that might be at risk of dropping out? Should we invest in vocational training? I don't know the answer, and neither does anybody else. But we do have the information now required to derive insights that are based on evidence, where we can begin to think this through in a way where we can generate outcomes. If you think about city planning, similar logic applies. We have cities in the developing world seeing 30, 40, 50% growth. How are we going to provide services? Where should we be investing our money if we're trying to build out the water system or build more schools? Right now, we don't plan based on information. What we need to become better at doing is leveraging the information that exists and predicting what we need to do in the future. That's the only way over the next 20 years, when this explosive urbanization is going to occur, that we can plan in any type of a strategic way that's aligned with the money that we need to spend to accomplish our objectives. We need to manage better. 2, we need to collaborate better. I have an example that I think really illustrates this. So the city of Rio de Janeiro, or in the hillsides, there's a lot of slums. And a number of years ago, there was a rainstorm and mudslides that killed hundreds of people. So the mayor of Rio decided he didn't want that to happen again. So he brought all of his emergency responders into a room, and he said, when an emergency happens, who's responsible for responding to it? 30 hands went up. Well, of course, we all know that if everybody's responsible for responding, then nobody's responsible for responding. So what they did is they created an information platform. It brings in Twitter feeds, cameras, predictive weather modeling. And they aligned all of the business processes associated with these 30 agencies around this source of information. And the result has been a 30% decrease in emergency response times. Yes, the technology played a role here, but it took collaborating based on information between all these different agencies that led to the result. It led to an outcome. And you know why? Because if something doesn't happen the way it's supposed to, the mayor knows who to talk to. He knows who's supposed to respond. He knows who to hold accountable. And that type of transparency and accountability is what we need in our cities, in our agencies. We need to collaborate more effectively together. Point number 3, we need to optimize. Cities are made up of core systems: water, transportation, public safety, healthcare. How do we get core urban systems operating more effectively? It's estimated that 50% of the water in the pipes in African cities is lost before it reaches the end user. Pretty staggering statistic. So I found it very surprising when I was in Nairobi a few months ago, attending a meeting about a large multi-$100 million donor-funded project, that the staff very carefully went through how they were going to pipe the water, where it was going to come from, where the population was expected to be. But there was no discussion about how the asset was going to be maintained. So I raised my hand and I said, what are you planning to do in terms of putting sensors on the pipe so we can detect water leakages, or maintaining the asset? Silence, nothing. So if we're going to make investments in our cities, we need to make them in a way that's going to produce results. And that requires data and information and doing it right the first time. And you can apply this across any other city system as well. Thinking about transportation, what type of investments should we be making in transportation now? They're going to produce results later. If we don't make the right investments now, we have to pay for them more later. So a water system, if the water leaks, it's less money for the water company and less ability for us to invest in new sources of water supply for areas that are going to grow in the future. Information, outcomes, collaboration, management. This is how cities are going to diverge. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to change our model? Or are we going to forget the constraints of the past and look to the future? Or are we going to continue with business as usual and end up in a situation where urbanization is happening in a completely unsustainable way? I think a short quiz will help us understand how we need to be thinking about this moving forward. So you can't see this, but no one's ever gotten this right. This is Alexander Graham Bell, the creator of the telephone. Completely revolutionized the way we communicate with one another. And now, does anybody know who this is? Only one person's ever gotten this. This guy's name is Mo Ibrahim. So in the mid-1990s, Mo Ibrahim had a crazy idea. He wanted to start a mobile phone company in Africa. And as he went to investors, the investors said, Mo, this is totally crazy. Africa has no phone lines and very little technology at this point. Well, it turns out Mo wasn't crazy. There are now 900 million mobile phone subscribers in Africa with 70% penetration. And it's totally transformed the way people interact with one another on the continent. So why do I bring up this story? If we're going to make progress in urban areas, we need to skip the landline and go right to the mobile phone. We need to become more strategic in terms of the investments that we make and the standards that we hold ourselves on in terms of accomplishing things for people. So I'll finish off with a question that I asked earlier. What is a city? I think at its core, a city is a place where people can fulfill their ambitions, realize their dreams, and set the groundwork for success. The way that our governments operate and we interact with our government is a critical determinant of this. I'm a political scientist, and institutions matter, and government matters because it produces the overarching conditions that allow us to succeed. So my question to all of us today is, how are we going to collaborate, citizens, the private sector, government, to produce outcomes that matter for people? And how are we going to commit to doing this in a time frame before it's too late? I'm optimistic. I think we can do it. What it's going to take is leadership, dedication, focus, and a lot of effort. But if we can change how we organize for urbanization, I remain confident that we can build a smarter planet, one city at a time. Thank you.